A thin disk of white polymer, the size of an egg. A technician at the Atomic Weapons Establishment in Foulness, England, places it on a steel platform and steps behind a blast shield. The laser fires. 10,000 degrees Celsius hit the surface. That is hotter than the edge of the sun. The disk does not melt. It does not crack. When the technician picks it up 30 seconds later, the back of the disk is cool to the touch. The material is called Starlite. The man who invented it was not a physicist. He was not a chemist. He was a hairdresser from Blackburn, Lancashire, named Maurice Ward, and he mixed it in his kitchen from 21 organic ingredients. It survived a thermal pulse designed to simulate the fireball of a nuclear detonation, and when he died in 2011, the formula went with him. But Starlite is only the start. Across the 20th century, 10 devices emerged that should have reshaped medicine, materials science, and energy itself. Each one was tested. Each one produced results that peer-reviewed institutions could not explain, and each one vanished, confiscated, buried, or taken to the grave by inventors who trusted no one. These are not conspiracy theories. These are patents, lab reports, and court transcripts. The question is not whether these machines worked. The question is why you have never heard of them. Maurice Ward was obsessed with fire, not fighting it, surviving it. In the late 1980s, after watching a news report about a plane crash caused by toxic cabin fumes, he began experimenting with polymers in his home kitchen. The result was a paste that, when applied in a thin layer, expanded into a carbon foam under extreme heat, dissipating thermal energy in a way that no known material could replicate. In 1990, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, ran a live demonstration on its program Tomorrow's World. A raw egg coated in Starlite was held over a blowtorch for 5 minutes. The presenter cracked it open on camera. The egg was still raw inside. The footage still exists in the BBC archive. What followed was a parade of suitors. Boeing reached out, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration tested samples. The British Ministry of Defence ran the Foulness nuclear simulation. Professor Keith Lewis, at the Royal Signals and Radar Establishment, stated publicly that the material violated every known rule of thermal transfer, dispersing catastrophic heat loads almost instantaneously. And Ward turned them all down, every single offer. Not because the money was wrong, because the terms were wrong. Imperial Chemical Industries wanted the full formula. Boeing wanted exclusive rights. Ward wanted royalties, not a buyout. He wanted to remain the sole custodian of a compound he had never written down. His paranoia was legendary. When NASA engineers tested Starlite samples, Ward made them wash their hands afterward, scrub under the fingernails, so that no microscopic residue could be carried out of the lab. He never filed a patent, because a patent would require disclosing the ingredients. He never published a paper. He kept the formula in his head. And then he died. Heart attack, 2011. His family claims the formula was divided among several relatives. A company called Starlite Scientific briefly surfaced, then went quiet. As of today, not a single gram of Starlite has reached the commercial market. Skeptics point out that intumescent coatings, materials that expand into insulating foam under heat, are not new. Commercial fireproofing paints use similar principles. Ward's material, they argue, was simply a better version of existing chemistry, not a thermodynamic miracle. And the 10,000-degree laser claim? Measured at the surface of the beam, perhaps. But the actual heat transferred to the sample depends on exposure time, contact area, and ablation rate. The numbers may be less supernatural than the headlines suggested. That is a reasonable objection. And it would close the case, except that no independent lab has ever reproduced the effect. Reasonable or not, the skeptics are arguing from theory. Ward demonstrated the material on live television. The gap between those two positions is where the real story lives. A material that could have fireproofed aircraft cabins, shielded spacecraft, and protected firefighters from flashover. Gone. Not because anyone suppressed it, because one man refused to let go. The question that nags at me is simpler than you might expect. Ward was a hairdresser. He had no formal chemistry training. He mixed 21 ingredients by hand. So how did he stumble onto a thermal profile that research teams with million-dollar budgets have spent decades failing to replicate? The machine stood 2 stories tall. In a basement laboratory in Bordeaux, France, it hummed at a frequency that made the walls vibrate. Inside its core, Mercury vapor glowed violet under high-frequency plasma discharges, generating a magnetic field of 600 Gauss, modulated by signals that its creator never fully explained to anyone. The creator was Antoine Priori, a former Italian radar operator who had noticed something peculiar during the Second World War. Oranges stored near his radar equipment did not rot. They stayed fresh for weeks, while identical oranges elsewhere decomposed on schedule. That observation launched a 30-year obsession. By 1964, Priori had built a device he called the M600, and what it did to laboratory rats became one of the most contentious scientific scandals in French history. Researchers at the University of Bordeaux implanted rats with T8 sarcoma, a type of tumor engineered to be 100% fatal. No treatment existed. Every control animal died. Then they placed groups of implanted rats inside Priori's machine for daily sessions. The tumors regressed completely. Every single rat survived. More than that, when scientists later tried to re-implant the same cancer in the cured rats, the tumors would not take. The animals had acquired permanent immunity to a previously incurable disease. These results were not whispered in hallways. They were published in the Compte Rendu, the official reports of the French Academy of Sciences, in 1964, 1965, and 1971. The experiments were supervised by military observers. The secretary of the Academy himself, Robert Courier, vouched for the methodology. France's Prime Minister, Jacques Chaban-Delmas, personally supported the funding. And then, the Academy of Medicine refused to publish the follow-up studies. The accusation was extraordinary. Priori, they claimed, had swapped the mice, replaced the sick ones with healthy animals. This despite the fact that each rat had been individually tattooed and tracked by independent military monitors. The scandal became known as l'affaire Priori. Journalist Jean-Michel Grail documented the political dimensions in his 1984 book, calling it one of the most deliberate acts of scientific sabotage in modern French history. Priori died in 1983. His laboratory was sealed. Funding was terminated. The M600 was dismantled. The mainstream position is straightforward. The results were anomalous, the methodology was insufficient, and Priori's refusal to reveal his frequency modulation scheme made independent replication impossible. Fair assessment. Except for one uncomfortable detail. Nobody ever demonstrated that the results were wrong. They were not debunked. They were not reproduced and failed. They were simply abandoned. What frequency modulation turns a magnetic field into a tumor killer? Why did mercury vapor matter? And if a radar operator in Bordeaux accidentally discovered something about electromagnetic effects on cellular immunity, what would it take for someone to look again? Now, hold that thought about electromagnetic fields and living cells. Because 20 years before Priori built his machine, a Russian-born engineer in Paris arrived at an eerily similar conclusion through completely different reasoning. Georges Lakhovsky, a Russian-born electrical engineer who had fled to Paris after the revolution, spent the 1920s studying something that his colleagues in radio transmission considered absurd. He believed every living cell was a microscopic oscillating circuit, a biological antenna resonating at a frequency determined by its chemical composition and physical structure. Disease, in Lakhovsky's framework, was not an invasion. It was a disruption of frequency. A cell knocked off its natural resonance would degrade, restore the oscillation, and the cell would repair itself. The device he built to test this hypothesis looked like nothing in any medical catalog. The multi-wave oscillator consisted of concentric copper rings of decreasing diameter, each split open at a single point, mounted on a stand and connected to a spark gap transmitter. When powered, the rings generated an extraordinarily broad spectrum of electromagnetic harmonics, from radio waves to infrared to near ultraviolet, all simultaneously. The logic was almost absurdly democratic. Flood the body with every possible frequency and let each cell select the one it needs, the way a tuning fork will only vibrate in response to its matching pitch. In 1924, Lakhovsky conducted his first experiment. He inoculated geranium plants with a cancer-causing bacterium, then placed copper coils around some of the infected plants. The coiled plants recovered, the controls died. He published the results. He moved to human trials in Paris clinics during the 1930s, documenting cases of tumor reduction and symptom remission. He published his full theory in a book titled The Secret of Life in 1935. The medical establishment treated him as a curiosity, not hostile enough to attack, not credible enough to test. In 1942, Lakhovsky was struck and killed by a car on a New York street. He was 73 years old. Within months, every multi-wave oscillator installed in American hospitals was removed by order of the American Medical Association. No explanation was published. No clinical evaluation was performed before the removal. No paper documented whether the devices had helped, harmed, or done nothing to the patients they were treating. The machines were simply collected and taken away. The connection to Priore is impossible to ignore. Two men, 2 decades apart, both working in France, both proposing that electromagnetic fields could influence cellular health, both producing results that institutional medicine refused to examine. Lakhovsky was killed by traffic. Priore was killed by bureaucracy. The machines of both men ended up in the same place, nowhere. Coincidence is a comfortable word, but when the same pattern repeats with the same outcome in the same country, comfort starts to feel like a choice. What Lakhovsky claimed to influence, a man in Quebec claimed to see, and the instrument he used to see it should not have been possible. Gaston Naessens, a French-born biologist working in Sherbrooke, Canada, spent the better part of the 1950s building an optical microscope that the laws of physics said could not work. Conventional light microscopes are limited by the wavelength of visible light. Beyond about 2,000 times magnification, the image dissolves into diffraction noise. Electron microscopes can go further, but they require killing and coating the sample. You cannot watch a living cell through an electron microscope. It is already dead before you look. Naessens claimed his device, the somatoscope, achieved 30,000 times magnification on living, unstained blood samples in real time. He used ultraviolet illumination, a custom condenser, and optical techniques he never fully disclosed. Through this lens, Naessens reported seeing tiny particles in human blood that he named somatids, subcellular entities that cycled through 16 distinct morphological forms. In healthy blood, the somatids stayed in the first 3 stages. In diseased blood, cancer, degenerative illness, they progressed into later forms. He claimed he could predict disease before symptoms appeared by watching the cycle. Mainstream biology had a blunt response. Somatids do not exist. The resolution Naessens claimed violates the Abbe diffraction limit. The particles were artifacts, optical noise, contamination, or self-deception. Naessens was charged with practicing medicine without a license after treating cancer patients with a camphor-based compound he called 714X. The trial in Quebec became a spectacle. Patients who had been told they were terminal came to testify that they were alive. Oncologists testified that the cures were impossible. The jury acquitted him. Christopher Bird documented the entire affair in his 1991 book, calling it one of the most important medical trials of the century. But the acquittal changed nothing in the scientific world. No independent laboratory attempted to build a somatoscope. No journal published a replication study. Naessens was free, but academically invisible, and that might be the cruelest verdict of all. Not conviction, not suppression, but silence. A room full of citizens believed him. The institutions with the tools to prove or disprove his claims simply refused to look through the lens. Leave the microscopes and oscillators behind. Where we are going now, the air smells of formaldehyde and old stone, and the year is 1833. In a cluttered workshop in Florence, Italy, a man named Girolamo Sagato, a naturalist and cartographer who had spent years in the Nubian desert, is doing something that his colleagues consider black magic. He is turning human flesh into rock, not metaphorically, literally. Sagato had developed a process he called mineralization, which replaced the organic matter in soft tissue with a mineral compound that preserved the original structure down to the level of individual blood vessels. The result was not a mummified corpse. It was not a plaster cast. It was stone that retained the texture of skin, the color of muscle, the architecture of capillaries. In the Anatomy Museum of Florence, you can still see his work. A table inlaid with over 200 fragments of petrified human tissue, skin, organs, cross-sections of muscle. In 2007, a team at the University of Florence performed CT scans on several specimens. The scans confirmed what the naked eye suggested. The finest blood vessels, thinner than a human hair, had been filled with a mineral compound that preserved their three-dimensional structure perfectly. This was not embalming. This was molecular replacement. I have spent more time than is healthy staring at photographs of that table. And the detail that keeps pulling me back is not the science. It is the psychology. Sagato could have published. He could have trained apprentices. He could have transformed preservation science a century before modern plastination. Instead, he did the opposite. On his deathbed in 1836, Sagato destroyed every note, every formula, every procedural record he had ever created. His colleagues had called his work sorcery. The church viewed it with suspicion, and so he burned it all. His reported last words were, "I did not believe death was so near." I only needed 1 more hour to explain. 1 hour. That is the margin by which the most advanced tissue preservation technique of the 19th century was lost. Some researchers believe the method involved mercury salts and a silicate compound, based on analysis of the surviving specimens. But no one has successfully reproduced the process in nearly 2 centuries. Sagato's secret did not die because someone seized it. It died because its creator chose destruction over the risk of being misunderstood. And I find that more disturbing than any government conspiracy. The idea that knowledge can be lost not through malice, but through fear. 2 cases now, Ward and Sagato, where the inventor was not silenced by an institution, but by their own grip on the secret. I have been chasing suppression stories for long enough to know the pattern. But this variant still catches me off guard. The locked door with no lock on the outside. Sagato burned his notes because the world called him a sorcerer. Half a century later, on the other side of the Atlantic, the world called Dinshaw Ghadiali a fraud, and then burned his books for him. Ghadiali, an Indian-born engineer and inventor who had settled in New Jersey, spent the 1920s developing a therapeutic system he called the spectrochrome. The principle was specific. Different wavelengths of visible light, he argued, corresponded to different chemical elements in the human body. Green light balanced nitrogen, red stimulated hemoglobin, blue calmed inflammation. By projecting precisely filtered light onto the skin, Ghadiali claimed he could treat conditions ranging from burns to diabetes. He designed a set of glass filters that isolated narrow spectral bands. He built projection devices. He trained physicians. He published an encyclopedia of protocols. By the 1930s, thousands of doctors across America were using the spectrochrome system. In 1947, the federal government brought Ghadiali to trial. The charge was fraud. The prosecution argued that colored light could not treat disease. Ghadiali presented letters from over 100 physicians, testifying to clinical results. The jury convicted him anyway. His sentence included a court order to destroy every copy of his published works. Let that settle for a moment. A federal court in the United States of America ordered the burning of medical books, not in the 15th century, in 1947. 2 years after the liberation of concentration camps, where book burning had been a symbol of everything America claimed to stand against. Ghadiali's patent, number 1,544,973, still exists in the United States Patent Office. The science of photobiomodulation, the use of specific light wavelengths to influence cellular function, is now a legitimate and growing field with thousands of peer-reviewed papers. Modern researchers do not cite Ghadiali. They do not acknowledge the man whose books were burned for suggesting the same principle 70 years earlier. Whether his specific protocols worked is debatable. That the underlying concept was correct is not. If Ghadiali was convicted for claiming light could heal, Ruth Drown was destroyed for claiming something far stranger. That a machine could photograph your liver from across the country using nothing but a drop of your blood. Drown, one of the first women to build and sell radionic devices in America, worked out of a small laboratory in Hollywood, California, through the 1930s and 40s. She constructed over 100 devices she called RadioVision. Each one was a wooden box fitted with 9 tuning dials, a well for sample placement, and a smooth rubber pad that the operator would stroke with their fingertips. Place a dried blood sample on the input plate. Calibrate the dials until the pad felt sticky under the thumb. The machine would then allegedly generate a photographic image of the patient's internal organs, regardless of whether the patient was in the next room or in another city. No credible physical mechanism has ever been proposed for how this could work. The images Drown produced were blurry, ambiguous, and open to interpretation. dark blotches on photographic paper that she labeled as kidneys, tumors, spinal columns. Independent tests conducted under controlled conditions at the University of Chicago failed to produce results above chance. In the late 1950s, the Food and Drug Administration raided Drown's laboratory. Her equipment was confiscated, files were seized, the machines were destroyed. She was charged with fraud and medical device violations, convicted, and sentenced to prison. Ruth Drown died behind bars without ever revealing the calibration method she said was the key to making radiovision function. The honest assessment. Drown's core claims were almost certainly wrong. The device probably did not image organs at a distance. The photographs were likely artifacts of the development process itself. And yet, the honest assessment should include the full story. Drown was not offered a scientific hearing. No panel of physicists sat with her device and methodically tested its limits. She was raided, tried, and imprisoned. Being wrong is not a crime. Selling a device that does not work can be fraud, but the line between genuine belief and deliberate deception was never examined in court. She was convicted before that question was properly asked. And the question of whether Drown was a fraud or merely wrong is not the same question, even if the legal system treated it that way. Arrested once is a bad year. Arrested 100 times is something else entirely. Harry Hoxsey set that record. A self-taught healer from Illinois with no medical degree and no patience for authority, Hoxsey claimed to have inherited a cancer treatment from his grandfather, a combination of herbal compounds and an electrical method that, he said, altered the membrane potential of malignant cells. The story of the formula's origin was pure Americana. Hoxsey's grandfather allegedly observed a horse with a cancerous leg grazing on specific wild plants until the tumor shrank. He collected the plants. He built a recipe. He passed it down. Hoxsey opened a clinic in Dallas, Texas in the 1930s. Patients lined up. The American Medical Association declared war. Morris Fishbein, the AMA's powerful editor and public voice, made Hoxsey a personal crusade. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, Hoxsey was arrested over 100 times. His clinic was raided repeatedly. He sued the AMA for slander and won. The AMA sued him back and won bigger. At its peak, his Dallas operation was the largest privately owned cancer treatment center in the world, serving thousands of patients a year. The Food and Drug Administration shut it down in 1960. Hoxsey moved the entire operation across the border to Tijuana, Mexico. The clinic still operates there today, run by a former nurse, using the same herbal formulas. No controlled clinical trial of the Hoxsey method has ever been conducted. No major research institution has tested the herbal compounds under modern protocols. The AMA declared it quackery in the 1950s. That assessment has never been updated, challenged, or revisited with contemporary methodology. Over 100 arrests, half a century of legal warfare, and the fundamental scientific question, does the treatment produce measurable results under controlled conditions, remains unanswered. Not because the answer is unknowable, because no one with the authority and funding to ask the question has ever bothered to ask it. Every device so far has been dismantled, confiscated, or buried with its creator. But the next one received something none of the others did, a stamp of legitimacy from the United States Patent Office. And that made it more dangerous to the establishment than any of them. On September 27, 1949, the U.S. Patent Office granted patent number 2,482,773 to Thomas Galen Hieronymus, an electrical engineer from Kansas City. The patent described a device that could analyze what Hieronymus called eloptic energy, a form of radiation that behaved like light but could be transmitted through copper wire. The machine used a prism to refract this energy at different angles, each angle corresponding to a different chemical element. By adjusting the prism and touching a sensor pad, the operator could reportedly detect the chemical composition of a substance placed in the input well. Hieronymus documented experiments in which plants grown in total darkness received what he called transmitted solar energy through copper cables, and produced chlorophyll. Mainstream physics has a simple verdict. Eloptic energy does not exist. The sensor pad produces a subjective stickiness that corresponds to the ideomotor effect, the same unconscious muscle movement that drives dowsing rods and Ouija boards. The planned experiments were not conducted under proper controls, all reasonable objections. And then John W. Campbell entered the picture. Campbell was the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, one of the most influential science fiction magazines in history, the publication that launched Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein. He was not a crank. He was a rigorous, skeptical editor with an engineering degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In the 1950s, Campbell built a Hieronymus machine, and then he did something that should have been the final nail in the coffin. He built a second machine using only paper. He drew the circuits on cardstock instead of wiring real components, schematic lines in pencil where copper traces should have been. No capacitors, no resistors, just ink on paper. And he claimed it worked identically. Same results, same stickiness on the pad, same diagnostic readings. Now, I have spent a lot of late nights scratching at locked doors on this channel, but this one does not even have a door. It has a drawing of a door, and somehow, according to Campbell, the drawing opens. Hieronymus himself was furious. He considered Campbell's paper machine a circus trick that undermined any chance of serious scientific investigation. If a drawing works the same as the real thing, then the machine is not detecting energy, it is detecting the operator's intention. And that puts the entire concept outside the boundaries of physics and into the territory of consciousness research. Personally, I think this is the most unsettling case in the entire list. Not because the machine works, it almost certainly does not, at least not the way Hieronymus described, but because Campbell's experiment accidentally asked a question that physics still cannot answer. At what point does the observer become the instrument? And why does that question make scientists so uncomfortable that they would rather ignore the data than confront the implication? The last case is different from every one before it, because the inventor is not obscure. He is one of the most important figures of the 20th century, and the device he built did not just produce anomalous readings on a sensor pad, it produced measurable, verifiable nuclear fusion on a table. Philo Farnsworth invented television, not contributed to it, not refined someone else's prototype. At the age of 14, plowing a potato field in Rigby, Idaho, he looked at the parallel furrows in the soil and conceived the idea of scanning an image line by line with an electron beam. At 21, in 1927, he transmitted the first fully electronic television image, a single bright horizontal line, to investors in a San Francisco laboratory. Every screen you have ever watched descends from that afternoon. By the 1960s, Farnsworth had moved on from the invention that changed the world. Working at the International Telephone and Telegraph Research Laboratory in Fort Wayne, Indiana, he built a device he called the fuser, a spherical vacuum chamber with an inner grid charged to high negative voltage. Deuterium ions, accelerated inward by the electrostatic field, slammed together at the center with enough energy to fuse their nuclei. The process is called inertial electrostatic confinement. And it worked. The fuser produced neutrons, measurable, repeatable, documented neutron flux, the unmistakable signature of deuterium-deuterium fusion. The ITT laboratory reports from 1965 through 1967 confirm this. The device fit on a workbench. It required no billion-dollar tokamak, no superconducting magnets, no warehouse-sized containment vessel. It was elegant, compact, and demonstrably real. In 1967, ITT canceled the project. The Atomic Energy Commission had staked its reputation and its budget on the tokamak path, enormous, government-funded reactors that would consume decades of research and tens of billions of dollars. A compact desktop alternative invented by a private citizen did not align with institutional priorities. The fuser's funding was redirected. Farnsworth's laboratory was closed. His team was disbanded. He never recovered. By the end of the decade, Farnsworth was broke, depressed, and largely forgotten. He died in 1971 at the age of 64. The man who gave the world the television screen spent his final years in obscurity, his last and possibly greatest invention shelved by the bureaucratic machinery of Cold War science. The fuser did not disappear entirely, and this is what separates Farnsworth's story from every other case on this list. Today, hobbyists and students around the world build working fusers in garages and school labs. Amateur scientists have achieved verified neutron counts using Farnsworth's original design, documented on open-source forums and confirmed by Geiger counters. High school students have won science fairs by demonstrating nuclear fusion at home. The device is real. The physics is sound. The engineering is reproducible by a motivated teenager with a vacuum pump and a power supply. What the fuser has always lacked is not proof of concept. It is the institutional will and the funding to explore whether it could ever scale to net energy production. Here is what I keep circling back to. Every device on this list was dismissed by the institutions that should have investigated it. Some deserved dismissal, some did not. But in every single case, the pattern is identical. The question was closed before the investigation was complete. A hairdresser's polymer that no materials lab has replicated. A radar operator's machine that cured cancer in rats and was never tested on humans. A naturalist's preservation technique lost on a deathbed. A television pioneer's fusion reactor abandoned for a bigger, more expensive alternative that still has not delivered on its promise after 60 years. These are not stories about mad scientists in basements. These are stories about what happens when an answer arrives before the institution is ready for the question. Which of these 10 machines do you think deserved a second chance and never got one? Pick one. Make your case in the comments. The most convincing argument gets pinned. Subscribe. The next investigation is already underway.